Hello, everybody, and welcome to this live session of the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science webinar series. We have a very special guest with us tonight, my friend, Dr. Nathan Lents. He's going to talk to us about how we humans like to think of ourselves as highly evolved creatures. But if we are supposedly evolution's greatest creation, why do we have such bad knees? Why do we catch head colds so often, 200 times more often than a dog does? And how come our wrists have so many useless bones? Why is the vast majority of our genetic code pointless? And are we really supposed to swallow and breathe through the same narrow tube? Surely there's been some kind of mistake. Well, Dr. Nathan Lents is an American scientist, author, and university professor. He's been on the faculty of John Jay College since 2006 and is currently the director of their honors program and the Campus Macaulay Honors College program. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Lents is noted for his work in cell bio, genetics, and forensic science, as well as his popular science writing and blogging on the evolution of human behavior and biology. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Lents. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for the invitation.
So I'm going to let people know that to please, if they have questions, there is an Ask a Question section here along the bottom of the screen, and I will be also minding your chat rooms. So if you ask questions there, I'll also, I could ask those. And I have put the link to Dr. Lents' book in the chat as well. So it's all yours.
Okay, great. And now I need to share my screen, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so this is a different platform than I'm used to, so a couple of steps, and then I'm going to make sure that you, and I can hear you, right?
Yep,
Once
I'm not going anywhere.
Okay, once we get going. And I'm going to do just the PowerPoint, I think. And I think you should be able to still see. Can you see that?
Yep,
Okay.
We see that. That's it. Perfect.
Now, I'm now on full screen. Can you still see my face?
We can have you
large
like this, or I can make you smaller. All right, I'm going to go ahead. We see you in the corner now.
Okay, I can't see myself, but I don't care about that. I'll just move ahead. But you can see everything just fine, the screen?
Yeah, I see the orange book cover, and
okay.
We're ready to go.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to come and speak to you tonight about human evolution. It is true that I wrote a book called Human Errors, which was all to do with human flaws and imperfections. And sort of the joke of this book was that I wrote my first book on comparative human and animal behavior. And I blog a lot about evolution and the evolution of human behavior, but it's never been a research interest of mine. I'm not a psychologist, and nor an animal behaviorist, actually. And so my mother, after I wrote my first book, or as I was writing my first book, she didn't understand how I could, write a book about something that I don't do research on. And then when she found out I was writing my second book all about human flaws, that made a lot more sense to her. She's like, finally, something you know a lot about. So that was sort of the segue into the second book, was that we are a very flawed species. And there's several sort of theses or themes to this book, most of which are surprising to a lot of casual readers, which is why I thought the book was worthwhile to write. The one thing I'll say is that I think human beings are actually probably the most flawed creature, certainly the most flawed mammal, maybe the most flawed vertebrate. And a lot of people sort of, are surprised by that. They would think that humans are as perfected as any other species. And really the theme of the book is that, first of all, there's no such thing as perfection. But more importantly, humans have more flaws than most animals precisely because we're so good at navigating around our flaws and compensating for them. And one example I used to give about why humans, one way that humans get around this is that I used to have very, very poor vision. My distance vision was 2425, something like that. I forget what my prescription was, but I had very, very thick glasses, and now I don't anymore. My eyes work just fine. And my biology didn't change. I paid someone to shoot lasers into my eyes and fix them. And in fact, I used the advance from a book all about human flaws to fix one of my flaws. And that's actually a perfect example of how we have evolved our way around our flaws using our brains. In this case, it was the brain of a physician. It was somebody else's brain. But we were in a cultural exchange. And that's really the theme of the book, is that humans have that cultural exchange with each other. None of us has to be perfect because we all rely on each other. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty glad that I don't live and die based on how good my body works. So that's that, and most animals do, right? Except for humans. So I think it's a great tool for teaching, and this is the version of my book talk that I do give to teachers and students talking about evolution, because there are some very specific lessons about evolution that you can learn by studying imperfection. One of them is the idea, it gives you the chance to push back against a very pervasive idea among biology students and even biologists, that organisms are perfectly adapted for their environment. And you'll see this a lot in textbooks. And a lot of people, even scientists, on a multiple choice test, they might not choose that choice. They might not get that answer wrong. But the bias that organisms are perfectly adapted for how they live really is pervasive in our thinking. And so the idea is, well, if an animal has that certain structure or does that certain thing, it must do something, or evolution would have fixed that by now. And that's just not true, actually. Evolution is very sloppy. A lot of things are in evolution's blind spot, and a lot of how we evolve are trade-offs and compromises. And so you have to dig a little bit deeper before you can make sense of all that. Another lesson that's important that comes out of this book is that another bias that humans have is that we are the pinnacle of creation or evolution, however you look at it, that we're the sort of the apex, and the history of life on Earth has been this sort of steady march toward an ever more perfect form until humans arrived, Homo sapiens, masters of the planet. And really nothing could be further from the truth in terms of biology. We do have some very, very special skills in which we exceed all of the other animals. Those are all cognitive skills. And our social structure, which flows from those cognitive skills, is unique. But basically everything else about us operates under the same principles as everything else that walks the earth. And in fact, as I've argued, and as I will argue, if you subtract the prefrontal cortex from our biology, everything else about us is actually even more sloppy because we have taken the pressure off of our bodies for so many millions of years. I gave the example of me paying a physician to shoot lasers in my eyes. And that's a new technology, but we have been using technology and we have been using sociality to compensate for imperfection for a very, very long time. And I'll give you some examples of that. When I say long time, I mean millions of years. We've been sort of taking the pressure off of our body and instead using our brains. Another interesting lesson that comes out of learning about imperfection is it teaches you about the limits of evolution and how evolution can operate with the body as it exists in that moment of time through tweaks and tugs only, and random tweaks and tugs at that. And so if you could imagine a human being growing wings and subsequently the ability to fly, obviously that would have enormous advantages. Why don't we have wings? Why don't more lineages have wings? Wings open up all kinds of potential. But actually what we know is that if you look at vertebrates only, wings have only been invented 3 times successfully over long-term lineages. 3 times among vertebrates: the birds, the mammals, the flying mammals, and the pterosaurs, which of course have all gone extinct. So there's really only 2 clades now, the mammals and birds, flying mammals and birds, that have figured out how to fly. Why not? Well, because in order to get to the point where you have fully functional wings, you have to sacrifice a whole lot of other functionality, right? It would be great if new wings just sprouted out of our back, but there's no advantage along the way, right? You wouldn't have any natural selective advantage until the wings were already fully formed. There's just no way to get there. As the old saying is, there's no way to get there from here. So the only way that you can adapt wings, and this has happened the 3 times in vertebrates, is to co-opt the forelimbs. So birds lost everything else that they used to do with their front limbs. So they cannot grasp very well, for example. And there's other lost functionality there as well. So it's actually, the evolution of wings is a highly improbable event because of everything that's lost. And in fact, we know that among several lineages of birds no longer fly. So they've evolved out of their way of flying because flying comes at such great costs. And the other thing is that when you study human imperfection, you can learn a lot about how our ancestors lived. So I often say the body is, one way to retrace our ancestry is through fossils and so forth. But another way is to look at our body as it exists right now, and you can see how we used to live. You can get little lessons about our ancestral past. And once you sort of make peace with that past and make peace with the limitations of our body, you can live in better harmony with your body. And in fact, you can learn important lessons on how to live in a sort of more evolutionarily correct way. And in fact, a whole field has sprouted from this called evolutionary medicine, which talks about diet, medicines, posture, how you use your body day to day, how you sleep, how you eat, and try to sort of recapitulate the ancestral past in some of those habits and see if it's helpful. Several very important insights have come from this. And one of them, which gets a lot of press right now, is a low carbohydrate diet. Many of you who are older, who are maybe my age and older, will remember that there have been waves of fad diets, basically. Low-fat diet was really big in the 80s. Fat was the enemy. Now we know, of course, that fat's not the enemy at all. It's carbs. What was that? And dietitians were breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and try to minimize fats and all of this. We now know that actually you don't need breakfast. You don't need to eat early in the morning. You don't even need to eat 3 meals a day, 2 meals a day, 1 meal a day is perfectly fine. And in fact, probably better. And low or no sugar is better. And that insight didn't come from the study of dietetics. It came from the study of evolution. As it became more and more clear to anthropologists who study our history, that we didn't eat at all like we eat now. And in fact, carbohydrates formed a very small part of our diet for millions of years. And it really wasn't until the invention of farming that we got to our current state, where 75% of the world's calories are consumed as carbohydrates. And that's just not how we're built. And in fact, if you look at all the cuisines and cultures around the world, the staple food in the diet is always a carbohydrate of some kind, whether it's rice or wheat or millet or whatever it is, it's always a high carb, because that's what farming allowed. But that's not the way that we should be eating. Okay, so my book is organized into a series of chapters. But before I talk about the themes of each chapter, I want to talk about the 3 sort of categories of human errors, how you can sort of classify each of the little quirks. And we'll get to some examples soon enough. One of them was what we call mismatch. And I was just hinting at this with the carbohydrate-based diet. But there's lots of ways in which we use our bodies not in the way that they were intended to be used. And intended implies a creation event, which is not what I mean. But the way that the forces that shaped our body have now been turned on their head. And I suspect that many of you right now are watching this webinar in what I call an evolutionarily incorrect posture. You're sitting in a chair. And I hate to tell you this, I know they're comfortable, but chairs are just no good for us. You really are better off minimizing the time that you spend in a chair. To be honest, you probably shouldn't be wearing shoes as much as we do. That actually a lot of the comforts that we have in our way of life has actually created a lot of weaknesses in our bodies, and sometimes it's hard to reverse. I myself am standing right now, and I do a lot of what I can to stand throughout the day, at least while I'm working. When I'm resting, it's different, but I do try to get out of my chair as much as possible, both at work and at home. And I haven't had back pain in about 3 years, and I used to have quite a weak lower back. So I recommend trying to get out of your chairs as much as possible. So it's big with diet, but with other things, we're just not using our bodies in the way that they were intended to be used. There are also categories of errors that I call trade-offs. And this is where I was talking about the wings before, but there's lots of other examples where evolutionary forces of leading to fitness and adaptation were pressing on something that couldn't give. And so some compromise was reached. One example is the shape of our back, which causes a lot of problems. Where if you look at the other apes and you look at our ancestors in our deep past, who before they started walking on 2 limbs, and they were mostly ambling about in the trees, swinging from the trees or ambling on 4 legs, you'll notice that their backbone has a J shape with a very soft slope to it, but it has basically an upside down J shape to it. That's how a chimpanzee vertebral column looks. A gorilla, they have a J shape to it. Well, in order for us to stand upright, we had to straighten that. But simply straightening it wasn't an option. for a variety of reasons. For one thing, you lose the ability to hang, which is what we do, our internal organs. It's not as easy to hang them to a single chassis in the back. It'd be great to run a rod right through the middle of the body, but that's not an option either. So instead of unstraightening the curve at the top, what we did is we had a second curve, which I can't make that shape with my hand, so that we have an S-shaped spine, sometimes called a sigmoidal spinal column. So we have an S shape. That's how we stood upright. That was the trade-off, but that causes a lot of problems because now instead of having just one weak point at the top, we have a second weak point at the bottom, which is an even sharper curve, and that's where we get our slipped discs because the forces in a curved are borne by that curve shape to it. It's just not built to withstand that pressure. And a slipped disc is what happens when the little discs of cartilage slip out of place in between the bones, the vertebrae. And when that happens, it's called a herniated disc. It's very painful. That is unheard of in the other apes. Gorillas, chimpanzees, this is not an injury that our close relatives ever deal with. It's purely a result of the trade-off of our back when we began to walk upright. We have similar trade-offs in our knees and our ankles that create weak points. One way I put it in the book is that we basically never completed the evolution of bipedalism. Bipedalism, walking on two legs, we made that transition very, very quickly in our ancestral past, very, very quickly. If you look at the fossil record, you have fully arboreal species and fully terrestrial or partially terrestrial species that, while still tied to the forest, were definitely walking on two legs. It was almost in a blink of an eye. And anything you do quickly, you don't do well. And evolution it's a perfect example of that. So that quick evolution to upright walking left several weak points that we just never really fixed. Now, the third category of errors that I cover in my book is just purely bad luck. It wasn't a compromise. There wasn't anything gained. It's not that we're using our body in a weird way. It's just bad luck. And bad luck happens. And if it gets fixed in a population through a process we call genetic drift, there's no way to unfix it. The best example of this, the one that people are most familiar with, and I do write about this in the book, this was well known before my book, but for some reason people quote my book as if I was the one who first described it. But one example of bad luck for us is our need for vitamin C. So we have a dietary need for vitamin C, ascorbic acid. We can't make collagen without it. Vitamin C does a few other things too, but that's really the key problem with vitamin C deficiency is we lose the ability to make collagen. And if you don't make collagen, essentially your tissues lose all their integrity and you fall apart, you bleed out of all of your orifices. It's a condition called scurvy, as you'll probably remember. So vitamin C is important. However, most animals don't need vitamin C in their diet at all. And those of you with pets, dogs and cats, you don't need to make sure they get enough citrus fruit, do you? And if you look at their dog food, they won't have any fruit in it at all. It's generally just meat and rice and sometimes a little bit of supplementation, but not of vitamin C. Dogs and cats have no need for vitamin C. So how do they do it? Why don't they die of scurvy? Well, they don't. They do just fine. It's because they make vitamin C for themselves. Ascorbic acid does all the same things in a dog and a cat that it does in a human, but they just make it themselves. So it's not really a vitamin, at least not a dietary vitamin for them, even though it is an important cofactor. So what gives? Well, there's several genes that are necessary to make this. They make it in their liver, by the way. That's the tissue that mammals make vitamin C in. Interestingly, fish make it in their kidney, what their version of their kidney. Somehow that functionality moved to the liver. Not so important, but it's an interesting process there. Anyway, most animals, terrestrial animals, make vitamin C in their liver. We don't. Why not? Well, one of the genes, in fact, the key gene, the final step in the synthesis of ascorbic acid it's a gene that codes for L-gulonolactone oxidase. GULO is the name of that gene for short. Well, that gene, we have it. We actually do have the GULO gene, but it's broken. It's broken through mutation. And it was broken a very long time ago. So we share this need for vitamin C with almost all primates. If you go, lemurs, the prosimians don't have this broken gene, but all primates, all other primates, including old world monkeys, new world monkeys, and apes, need vitamin C in their diet because the gene to make vitamin C was broken through mutation. Now, it's not just broken a little bit, it's been littered with mutations ever since then, because we're talking about an event that happened 50 or 60 million years ago, so it's continued to mutate unfettered by natural selection. Well, you might be wondering, well, why didn't the first ancestor of all these primates who got this mutation, why didn't she die of scurvy? You know, if she can't make vitamin C, believe it or not, I mean, you gotta remember it would have been her mother who had the mutation, and because only mutations that happen in eggs or sperm are passed on. So the irony of mutation is that any mutation that you suffer from, you don't pass on, and any mutation that you do pass on, you usually don't have any effects from, because they only affect your gonads, and specifically the germ cells. Anyway, the point is, she didn't get scurvy, she didn't die. Why? She must have already had vitamin C in her diet. So she must have lived somewhere where vitamin C is found naturally. Where is vitamin C found naturally? Tropical rainforest, among other places. And so primates have been restricted. And this is the bad luck. You might ask, well, okay, it didn't harm her, but it didn't help her either. How did it become so fixed in the population? And that's the bad luck. Mutation, okay, that was bad luck, but mutations are always happening. Natural selection clears them. If they're negative, right? But in this case, it didn't, and through just sheer bad luck, she became the ancestor of the mighty clade that we know of as primates, most primates, and it got fixed, and that's called genetic drift. Just bad luck, nothing gained. There's no upside. We just now need vitamin C. But this has restricted where primates can live ever since. So for 50 million years, primates have been restricted to climates where vitamin C is found naturally, and they got scurvy anytime they tried to migrate out of that. And for example, the entire continent of Europe was never successfully colonized by primates until humans. First Neanderthal and some of very recent ancestors, and then Neanderthals, and then modern humans, and we almost certainly suffered scurvy when we did. But by that point, we had learned to bring some food with us. We weren't quite farming yet, of course, but we were starting to manipulate our own diets a little bit. And so we had figured out foods that can not give us scurvy. We didn't know why, of course, but we knew what to eat and what not to. So that's an example of bad luck. I don't organize the book into those 3 chapters. The way that the chapters are organized in the book are as follows. So I go through anatomy, and I'll give you at least one new example of anatomy that I mentioned in the book where there's some errors there. I also, and so before I go through the chapters, I'll just give you some examples as I go. I'm gonna have to pick up the pace a little bit here because I want to make sure I'm done by 8:45 and leave time for questions. Okay, anatomy. So usually I ask this question to a live audience. Has anyone in the room ever had a cold? Usually if there's at least 30 or 40 of you, you can get 1 or 2 hands up there. Obviously I'm kidding. Americans get between 3 and 4 colds a year. If you have children, it's like 300 or 400 a year. So common cold is one of the most common ailments that we have. And this is a fairly unique thing to human beings, actually. The rhinitis and other, because it's actually a collection of syndromes, right? This is not something that the other primates deal with very much. Some of our farm animals do with some of these things, and that's because they live on top of each other the way that we do. But the other primates don't seem to get this. And one of the reasons why is that we have some funny anatomy in our sinus cavity. So if you look at the inside the bones of the face, of the head, we have some empty chambers in which that air doesn't really flow through very much. They're really just cavities. And the largest of those cavities are called the frontal sinuses. And I'm sorry, the maxillary sinuses. The frontal sinuses are up here. Can you see my cursor, Bertha? I don't know. Okay, well, I'll point with it, assuming.
Sorry, I had muted myself. Go ahead and move your cursor around.
Okay, you can see it?
No, I do not see your cursor.
Oh, okay, never mind. Well, the frontal sinuses are in the forehead. The maxillary sinuses, which are sort of in the center of this picture here, are right behind your cheekbones. And they're the largest chambers, largest sinus chambers. These actually have no function whatsoever in humans. In fact, I'm writing an article right now with a bunch of doctors because I wanted to have a lot of some ENT surgeons and so forth, a lot of backup on this hypothesis. But my hypothesis is that the nasal cavities don't do anything at all. These sinuses are purely vestigial structures that do more harm than good. Well, anyway, we have this this chamber, the maxillary sinuses in our cheeks, and it's a big open chamber, and it's filled with mucous membranes, and mucus is produced and then drains. And this is the idea is, of course, to catch any invaders that would come, and they're basically just mucus factories. Well, the weird thing about it is that the drainage pipe, the drainage hole where all this mucus collects and then is directed down to the nasopharynx and eventually swallowed, is at the top of the chamber. And you have to ask yourself, what sort of plumber puts the drain at the top of a chamber rather than at the bottom? And what that does is it forces us to work very hard to move the mucus upwards. And you do that with cilia. And most of the time it's fine. Most of the time it's fine. And in fact, you can, every now and then you need to clear your throat a little bit. That's that constant drainage of mucus from your nasal sinuses into your nasopharynx. You get a good swallow and you send it down to your stomach where it's safe and you can neutralize all the bacteria. Great. But why do you have them in the first place? Well, the reason we have nasal sinus cavities at all is because our ancestors did. And if you go back in time, mammals, the vast majority of mammals are snouted. So they have their nasal cavities are out here in a snout, and they have very large sinuses there. And that reveals the real purpose of the nasal cavity. It's for olfaction, it's for smell, because most mammals actually navigate the world through their sense of smell. So they pack in millions upon millions upon millions of olfactory receptors in their snout. And like, I don't know if you know this, but your dog recognizes you by your smell much more than by how you look. You can't FaceTime or Skype with your dog, but they can often recognize you way down the block, not by, and you can tell which way the wind's blowing, whether or not this works, but they can smell you, and that's how and they navigate the room the same way. They're just so attuned to senses of smell. And in fact, well, never mind, I have so many little anecdotes, but I'm going to save it. But the point is that most mammals, if you think of kangaroos, horses, dogs, cats even, are snouted, and they have these, they navigate the world this way. Well, in the origin of primates, started that shift away from the sense of smell towards the sense of vision. So we navigate the world with our eyes much more than with our nose. To accomplish that, we did a couple of things. First of all, we brought our eyes forward. The vast majority of mammals have their eyes much more on the side, which gives them a wider field of vision, but very poor depth perception. So by bringing the eyes forward, we have that stereoscopic three-dimensional vision where we can get good depth perception. The problem with that is that the snout would be right in the center of the field of vision. So what do we do is we regress the snout, since we don't need it for smell anyway. So we regress the snout into the face. So primates have a much flatter face. Apes have flatter faces even than most primates, and humans have the flattest faces of all. So we just basically shove those sinus cavities up in our face to get them out of the way. And that was the easiest thing to do. So they're totally left over, and that's why. But here's the thing, even among the apes, we have the worst deal in terms of how our sinus cavities are arranged. So chimpanzees, the drainage pipe is much lower in the maxillary sinuses. It's about halfway up that chamber, so they don't have to work quite as hard. They also spend much more time with their head not in what we would consider the vertical position. And so they're getting more help from gravity. Orangutans ditched, we have several paired chambers. They ditched two of their sinus cavities altogether to make more room in their face, and so they have a better arrangement there. Humans really did get the worst end of the deal, and that's why we get congestion. Because if this fills up, this chamber fills up with dust and allergens, bacteria, then drainage slows to a halt, and you get a festering pool of infected mucus, and that's a sinus infection. You can often get, those who get sinus infections can often get temporary relief if they lay down and they get a little bit of help from gravity, but it doesn't cure anything because by that point it's too late. You have that thick, very green, very viscous mucus that just doesn't flow. And by the way, the drain pipe there in the maxillary sinus is actually much narrower in humans than it is in other apes. Like I said, we really get the worst end of this deal. And you might wonder, well, why didn't evolution fix this? Well, this is one of those chances to learn one of the harsh realities of evolutionary mechanisms. Evolution didn't fix it because you don't die of the common cold very often. You don't take that mutation with you. You don't take that anatomy with you. It's uncomfortable, but you generally don't die of sinus infections. It doesn't really reduce your reproductive fitness. And so it's in evolution's blind spot. So evolution doesn't shape us to be comfortable or healthy or happy. It just shapes us to survive and reproduce. And if you can survive and you can reproduce, That's all evolution cares about. That's the harsh reality. Okay, so we have so I talked about the S-shaped spine. I'm going to skip through this since it's a quick one, but it leads to those. I already covered this. It leads to those slip discs. So if you look at the backbone, the human backbone here with this S-shaped curve, those weak points in the lumbar is where you get those herniated discs, as you can see in the second picture there. If you look at the ACL, which is, so this is a picture of the human knee from my book, and the patella has been removed, so you don't have the kneecap, so you can see the ligaments. There's most of the holding the upper leg and the lower leg, most of the weight is borne by two ligaments. The ACL is in the front, and the ACL really, especially during sudden movements, bears all that weight, and it's just not strong enough. So this is that part of that incomplete evolution to upright walking. And I go into more detail in the book about why that is. Okay, so there's anatomy. And that's the first chapter of the book, and it seems to be the chapter that most people have written about when they review the book, and which is great. I just hope they made it to the other chapters, because I mean, that's just chapter 1. Pardon me. Okay, so the next chapter is the chapter on the genome, and so I talk about all the weird things that are left over in our genome from our past, and a lot of inefficiencies in our genome. And one thing I like to throw little tidbits out from this chapter. So, for example, most people, if they teach biology, might be aware that only about 3% of our DNA is in the form of genes. And only about 1.5% of that is actually the coding region of genes. So most of our DNA doesn't code for either protein or RNA. What does it do? Some of it's regulatory, about 20% of it's regulatory, maybe 25% of it's regulatory. But the rest of it, as far as we can tell, really doesn't have any function whatsoever. And there's arguments about how much of the genome has no function. I'm pretty confident to say 75% of the human genome does absolutely nothing for us, or at least nothing good. And the way I get to that figure is that 75% of the human genome has not been maintained by natural selection, meaning there is no pressure on it to exist in any certain way. It might be a reservoir for future function, and that's fine, but evolution doesn't really think ahead. That's just getting lucky. Most of the human genome has no function whatsoever. And in fact, 9% of the human genome, 9% is viral carcasses from past virus infections that our ancestors suffered from and beat. So as you probably know, many viruses actually, as part of their life cycle, incorporate into chromosomes in their host cell. Well, if this was unlucky enough to happen in a gamete, you can have part of that viral genome left in the chromosome that gets passed on. And this has happened often enough that 9% of our DNA is actually viral in origin. And so one way to say it is we have more viral genes than human genes, because the human genes are only about 3%. So you have 3 times more viral genes than human genes is one way to think about that. And we also just have a lot of pseudogenes. So I give you the example of gulo, which is not functional. It's been littered by mutation, but it still looks like a gene. Gene annotation software still finds it. It's like coming across a car in a junkyard. It looks like a car. You can tell it's a car. It probably even has most of the parts of a car, but it can't operate as a car, even a little bit, right? You can't drive it. All it has to be missing is one spark plug. I don't know, are spark plugs still a thing in cars? I don't know. But at least one essential part's missing from that car, so it can't function, even though it looks like a car. Well, that's what the gulo gene for us. It's a broken gene. It's a pseudogene, sometimes called dead genes. Well, we don't just have a couple of these. I give an example of another one that's, in my mind, even more interesting than gulo, because it codes for an immune system protein called theta defensin, which is probably, if we had a functioning theta defensin, we would have better defenses against retroviruses, which means HIV might not have been the epidemic that it was, and that it still is. So because we know from the other apes, now chimpanzees also don't have theta defenses, but orangutans do, and the orangutan version of HIV doesn't bother them. It is not successful. So it's possible that theta defensin, if we had it, would have protected us against HIV. But we don't just have 1 or 2 of these pseudogenes. The current estimates on the number of pseudogenes that we have is 20,000. 20,000. I've heard estimates up to 40,000. I'm not sure I buy that one. Probably a more conservative estimate is 15,000. Remember, we only have about 20 to 22,000 protein coding genes. So we have almost as many broken genes as functioning genes. So if we use our car analogy, it's like our genome was more like a junkyard than a parking lot, or at least it's a half junkyard, half parking lot, all mixed in. So we have a lot of broken genes. We have a lot of viral DNA. We have also a lot of just parasitic DNA, whereas it's DNA that just simply copies itself. It may have originally been virus, although that's probably not the case. We don't know how some of them came about. Some of them we absolutely do. There's one that's called the ALU element that is in our genome. It's about 10% of our genome is this one repetitive DNA. It's there over 1 million times. It's about 300 base pairs long, and we have 1 million copies of it. It does nothing but copy itself. That's all it does. So again, more of our genome is ALU elements, these copied parasitic DNA than genes. So I talk about that in that chapter. I also talk about our diet. So I mentioned the carb diet, but we also just have a lot of needy. We have a needy diet in general. We need vitamin C, for example, but we also need a lot of things that other animals don't need supplemented for them. You know, you got to get vitamin B12, you got to get vitamin D. These are other, and several B vitamins are actually known to be dietary insufficiencies that humans have, whereas other animals just don't have such a needy requirements. If you think of the koala, all it eats is eucalyptus leaves generally. I mean, it can be perfectly healthy eating one type of one plant. Leaf. And most animals can have very, very simple diets, can totally thrive, but we can't. We need a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, make sure you're getting enough of that, but not too much of this. Why do we have this very demanding dietary needs? Well, part of the reason is that key parts of our evolution, we were the ultimate generalists. And so we ate whatever we could find. We were omnivores. So we ate meat when we could find it. When we couldn't, we would scavenge often bone marrow. So we were getting essentially animal products there. We were eating vegetables. We were eating roots, worms, sticks, whatever we could find, and we made a diet out of it. Well, once again, the lesson from evolution there is if you just serve this nice rich food. I mean, the rainforest is like living in a salad bowl. If you have all of this nice rich food of all different varieties, your body loses that functionality to make those nutrients itself. Through natural selection, through the randomness of mutation. If you're knocking out genes like gulo and it has no effect because your diet is so rich already, there'll be no consequence. And so the negative consequences of us having this varied, omnivorous, generalist diet is that we now need a generalist diet in order to survive and thrive. And so the best way to be healthy is not vitamin supplementation, by the way. I'm not a proponent or a fan of the supplement industry. What I am a proponent of is eating a varied diet. So try to eat nuts and seeds and fruits and vegetables every single day. And if you don't eat meat, you don't absolutely need meat to be healthy. In America anyway, in most of the West, it's much easier to be healthy while eating meat, but you don't have to eat meat to be healthy. You do have to worry about how you get your vitamin B12. That's really the only one you have to get from meat. I think seaweed has it as well, kelp. But all you do is get a little vitamin B12 supplement, and you're fine. So I already mentioned these. So that's scurvy. That's a drawing of scurvy. And this is talking about vitamin B12. Do we have time? Yeah, it's a quick story. So vitamin B12 is one of the weirdest ones too, because vitamin B12, it's also known as cobalamin, is a strange thing because it's only found in animal products. But yet neither carnivores nor herbivores have any trouble with vitamin B12 deficiency, but humans do. You're like, well, why is this? Well, if you look at the carnivores, they're getting it from their meat. Okay, fine. Where are the herbivores getting it? I mean, all the meat that we eat is from animals who themselves are herbivores. So if they're not eating meat, how are they getting vitamin B12? I mean, the cows that you're eating, why aren't they dying of vitamin B12 deficiency? Well, it turns out that cows and other herbivores have bacteria in their intestines that make vitamin B12 for them in their large intestine. So that's great. It's like vitamin K. You may have heard that story. Humans have this too. Vitamin K is made for us in our large intestine, and we absorb it. And that's why many people have never even heard of vitamin K, because it's not a dietary vitamin. We get it right in our gut. It's made for us by the bacteria. We absorb it. Vitamin B12 is the same way for all the herbivores. So why are we so lucky? Why don't we have that bacteria? Or maybe we can inoculate ourselves that bacteria and it would be fine. Well, it turns out we actually do have that bacteria. They live in our large intestine, and they make vitamin B12, but we don't absorb it. You know why? We don't absorb vitamin B12 in our large intestine. We absorb vitamin B12 in our small intestine. So we go to all the trouble of having these bacteria. They make the vitamin B12 for them, and instead of absorbing it, we send it to the toilet. And you can die of vitamin B12 deficiency while you have it being made for you in your large intestine and you're excreting it as waste. And in fact, there was a study that was done. Someone's got to be wondering this. Human feces is a dietarily sufficient source of vitamin B12. Don't recommend it. I don't think you'll find it on the menu anywhere. Hopefully not. Hope you don't get that desperate. But we actually make enough vitamin 12 to live on in our large intestine, but we excrete it rather than absorb it. We only absorb it in our small intestine. Poor design if I've ever heard it. And why we only express the receptor in the small intestine, in the duodenum, in the ileum, is actually a research question in my lab right now. And this is rickets. Okay, so if you don't get enough vitamin D, then you won't absorb calcium well enough from your diet. And if this happens while your bones are growing, you develop a condition called rickets. And if you have vitamin D deficiency as an older person, you get a condition called osteoporosis. But the point here is that you need vitamin D in order to absorb calcium, which itself is bad design, right? I mean, why do you need one thing in order to absorb another thing? Vitamin D does other things too, but whatever. You don't express what you need to absorb calcium unless you also get vitamin D, which is why we supplement milk with it, and we've largely solved the problem of rickets. However, why do we need vitamin D when most other animals don't? Well, there's a key activation step in their diet. There's a key activation step for vitamin D that takes place in the skin. So you have to activate the molecule with UV light, with UV irradiation, and that activates the molecule. Well, most mammals actually do that in their fur. So, and that's one of the hallmarks of mammals, is that they have fur and they activate vitamin D in their fur. Well, we ditched our fur. While we were evolving in the plains of Africa, of sub-Saharan Africa, as the rainforest shrunk, we found ourselves in the flatlands, in the grasslands, and we ditched all our hair for a variety of reasons, hypothesized reasons. And so then we have to activate vitamin D in our skin. Okay, that's fine and good, except for UV light on bare skin actually causes cancer. So we developed very dark skin as a way to prevent skin cancer. And that left us with a problem with vitamin D activation. UV also can damage folate. So there's a couple of problems with all this UV light. But that's fine if you're out in the sun for most of the day and bare skin. But as we migrated away and we get up to upper latitudes, what happened was we were having trouble getting enough UV light, because as you go to higher and higher latitudes, you put on clothes. So you're covering your skin and preventing the absorption of UV light, so you're not activating vitamin D. So a lot of cultures, a lot of peoples, were dealing with vitamin D deficiency and rickets. And so they lightened the skin in order to absorb as much UV light as they could. And that is the reason why vitamin D absorption, not skin cancer, it's actually vitamin D absorption, why skin tone among ethnic groups is directly proportional to latitude, with one exception, and the exception proves the rule. The one exception are the Inuit peoples of Alaska and Canada. They live at high altitudes while still having dark complexion in their skin. And the reason why is that they eat a diet high in whale blubber and fish oil, which has already activated forms of vitamin D. So that's the exception that proves the rule. I'm way behind, so I'm going to have to shoot ahead here. Reproduction, lots of problems with reproduction in human physiology, from the age of maturation to the creation of gametes. I know with 7 billion of us on the planet, it's weird to think about poor reproduction as a problem, but actually until quite recently, humans were pretty thin on the ground around the world, and we still do have somewhat low fertility rates. There's a lot of problems that I talk about in the book. The most famous one, of course, is anatomical. So if you look at the shape of the pelvis in chimpanzees, and if you superimpose the size of a chimpanzee skull at birth, you can see that the chimpanzee skull at birth fits right through a female pelvis just fine. However, what happened as humans began to walk upright, and that was the first step, anatomical step in our evolution, was upright walking. We had to sort of narrow the bottom of the pelvis, and we had to put the legs in the bottom rather than towards the side. So if you look at a chimpanzee, their legs flay outwards, and as they walk, they kind of swing their legs around. our legs go straight down, and that's what gives us that nice striding gait where we don't bounce around with each step. Our center of gravity pretty much stays right in the center as we walk. To do that, your legs have to go straight down. In fact, they actually go inwards. If you look at from the out to the inside, your knees are much closer together than your hips. To accommodate that, however, you'll see we change the shape of the pelvis. And if you look at an adult human pelvis superimposed with a skull at birth, in one of the best examples of a complete skeleton we have, about 2.5 million years old, is the Lucy specimen, which is Australopithecus afarensis. And you can see that that is just barely fitting through. So the skull had not grown particularly that much from the chimpanzee, but we had the narrowing of the bottom of the pelvis, and the legs were brought inward. Well, what happens then, years later, millions of years later, is that the skull grew as well. And so now if you superimpose a adult human female pelvis with a infant skull at birth, you can see that it doesn't fit, basically. And so one of the biggest problems with human reproduction is that death in childbirth by both of the parties involved is shockingly high. And childbirth is a very difficult procedure, I've heard. And that's unusual. If you look at most mammals, childbirth is not terribly difficult for most of them. If you can think of examples of animals that have trouble giving birth, they're all domesticated, which means they've been shaped by our choices rather than natural processes. But generally, animals in the wild have no trouble. If you've ever seen a giraffe being born, and you can find videos, or a deer, or even cows. I saw a cow born on my grandpa's farm one time. I mean, they shake themselves off, and they're off and running as they go. And the mothers are, there's a video you can find on YouTube of a gorilla giving birth, and she's barely noticing me. She's eating, she's caring for other children at the same time while she's in labor. It really is not a dramatic affair. It's really, in humans, almost a unique condition that we have this trouble because of our unique evolution. Modern medicine has mitigated this quite a bit, but not solved it, as you know. And in fact, maternal mortality is higher in the United States than it is in any other developed country, because we have such a poor relationship with childbirth. The compromise here was, obviously big brains are good for evolution, but our hips are narrow. Walking upright is good too. So evolution was sort of pulling on both ends of the rope. So the compromise that was made there was that we're just born too early. Humans are born, a lot of times, sometimes people say that the first 3 months of life are really the fourth trimester. Humans are born undercooked. We really need at least 3 more months of development. But if you waited that long, childbirth would be impossible. So and the consequence of that is very high infant mortality. Without modern medicine, children die in the first year of life very, very frequently. And also, children need a great deal of maternal and paternal care. So they're completely incapable. Again, if you look at other animals, when they're born, they're often quite capable and can move around and find their way. But humans really can suckle and cry, and that's about it. They rely on their parent support for decades, really 3 or 4 decades in many cases, of parental support in order to survive. And that creates vulnerabilities, and it makes infant mortality very, very high. I think I have some other examples, but I want to leave time for question. I know I've gone over by a few minutes. So I talk about some diseases in the book. All animals get sick. So how can I say that disease is a human flaw? Well, part of it is there are some diseases that we're evolved to have, that really evolution has almost specifically created these diseases. And I talk about a few of those. Sickle cell anemia is the most famous one, and so that's the one I have a figure on, but there's other examples in the book. And of course, we also have diseases, well, we have those too, but we have flaws and imperfections in our mind, the way our brain works, because our brain was it adapted and evolved in a very different world than the one we live in now. So we make poor choices, and I don't just mean we have limits, everything has limits. I mean that there are some mistakes that we make over and over and over again. Even when we have all the information, when we supposedly learned our lesson, we will continue to make errors in judgment. And these are sometimes called cognitive biases, but they lead to all kinds of very ill effects for society. And it was funny, I wrote this book before the 2016 election, But after the election, I usually didn't have to do much work to convince people that humans have flaws in our brains, and that this leads to societal consequences. But it's even worse than electoral politics, and I talk about that in the book as well. So thank you so much for your time and your patience. I've really not enjoyed seeing you, or I've not enjoyed not seeing you. I wish I could have seen you and interacted, but I'd be happy to take questions now. I'm not going to stop sharing, but I will maybe minimize the screen. I'm going to rely on Bertha to get this the way it should be. Should I stop screen sharing now?
You probably should, because then we come back up. So you've got quite a few questions.
Oh, great. Okay.
Well, first of all, there's a comment from Sean Ryan. He says your book is fantastic and he highly recommends it, 10 out of 10. So I thought
thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. You're the one. Could you tell my mother that? She'd appreciate it.
Here's a question from Adrian Rodriguez. Would vegans have a vitamin B12 deficiency if they didn't take supplements?
Would humans have a vitamin B12?
Vegans.
Oh, vegans. Yes. So if a vegan eats absolutely no animal products and doesn't eat seaweed, as far as I know, seaweed is the only vegan food that has vitamin B12 in it. Yes. So as far as I know, unless there's one that I've missed, but I've done, I've looked around and I've talked to vegans. And in fact, two of my friends are vegans. They were over here this afternoon in a socially distant way. And they say the same thing, that they take a vitamin B12 supplement.
Oh, okay.
As far as I know, there isn't another way to get it. But if you eat kelp, if you eat like nori or those seaweed chips, you might be all right there.
Yeah, I like those seaweed chips.
Yeah, my kids love them. I can't stand them. My kids love them.
Kristen Griffith asks, is vitamin D, are the receptors also found in the small intestine of other animals or only in the large intestine?
So this is your B12, right?
Vitamin D.
Okay.
Sorry, it's B12, but vitamin D is sun absorption. I think she meant vitamin.
Yeah, no, because vitamin D also, the receptors are there in the intestines as well, because it's necessary for calcium absorption. Anyway, so B12, where it's located and where it's expressed in the gut varies a lot among animals. And so if you leave carnivores aside, because carnivores don't have, it doesn't matter where it is, they'll absorb it. If you look at herbivores, there's really two types of herbivores when it comes to vitamin B12 absorption, the ruminants and the non-ruminants. Ruminants have an easier time of this because they are passing the food back and forth between their mouth and their stomach, and their mouth and their stomach. And so their microbiome is much more spread evenly throughout their intestines. And so the bacteria, while it's housed, and its preferential location, you could say, is in the large intestine, they're not as segregated into small intestine and large intestine as we are. And so the contents get mixed up a lot more. And so enough of the B12 makes it higher up in the digestive system that's where they absorb it. But they still absorb it in the small intestine. The non-ruminants, this is where it gets a little gross. As far as we can tell, the non-ruminant herbivores, dirt and fecal matter. So from as far as we can tell, they don't absorb it from their large intestine, and they obviously don't eat meat. By definition, they're herbivores, and so they're eating enough of pellets and dirt, which we assume a lot of that, because you got to remember that herbivores of all kinds generate a ton of waste, and that waste ends up in the dirt, and that's where those herbivores get it, the best we can tell. Okay. Yes, coprophagia, someone just said. That's right, yeah.
Well, we lost your video image, but we can hear you fine, so we'll just keep
going.
Do
something? Oh, my camera's still on, so.
Kristen says, thanks so much. That makes sense. So towards the very, very beginning of your talk, one of your attendees named Gabriel Cooley said, quote, evolution is not an expert designer. Evolution is more like a blind drunk man shooting darts, hoping that something sticks. And then another attendee, Oscar, said, I personally disagree. If you look into niche construction, you will come to see that if we were to reset time, Earth would have the same organisms or similar organisms to the ones we currently have, implying that there's a direction to evolution.
That's a great comment, question. And in fact, I've actually recently changed my mind on this issue as well. So Stephen Jay Gould used to always say, if you rewound the tape and rewound it, you would get totally different organisms. But I'm actually starting to think that some themes would would emerge over and over and over again. Ken Miller talks about this a little bit in his book from 2 years ago, but so does Charles Cockell. A couple of things probably are going to emerge every time. One is polarization of the body with cephalization and nervous system concentration on one end, and then a GI flow from this way to that way. The evolution of limbs. If you look at the things that have come out in multiple lineages, some of these things were bound to happen because they just make so much sense. And we would have stumbled upon a lot of the same solutions to these problems. It's interesting that you bring up niche construction as well, because humans are the ultimate niche constructors, the absolute ultimate ones. We completely recreate our environment, every environment that we've gone to. So if you look at what we've spent most of the last 6 million years in Africa, and most of the last 4 million years in the grasslands. So we're well adapted to that. But every environment that we went into, we were successful, not so much by changing to the environment, but changing the environment to suit us, whether that meant putting on clothes, for example, different tools, hunting different foods. We took that generalism that we had, and then we just extrapolated across the planet. And so every environment that we've gone into, we've reshaped it to serve our needs. And in fact, often with very negative consequences for that habitat. If you look at the loss of the megafauna throughout the Americas, it's, as far as we can tell, it was the humans that once the humans arrived, almost all of the very large animals went extinct. And so, yes, we are ultimate niche constructors. We've solved these problems, and it doesn't matter sort of what our limitations were, we would have found ways around them. So in terms of a directionality, I mean, I think there are definite trends towards increasing complexity, for example. If you look at plants and animals, so those are the only two clades that have evolved complex tissue organization. And they've done it differently. Obviously, animals have much more complex tissues than plants, but they've done it differently. And as far as we can tell, the biggest difference between plants and animals and the other eukaryotes that did not manage to go metazoan with all of these tissue types, we actually think we've found the key thing, and it's microRNAs, if you know what those are. MicroRNAs are very small RNA molecules that affect the expression of other genes, and in some cases thousands of other genes, but usually hundreds of other genes. And these little microRNAs, we think, allowed us to take our genome and essentially double its power or quadruple its power with the same number of genes, and you can get not infinite, but several orders of magnitude more complexity. And what's interesting about that to me, I know it's a long-winded answer, is that plants and animals evolved that separately. So they landed on, I mean, such a very specific solution. These little microRNAs that perform this specific function on other messenger RNAs and target them for degradation, blah, blah, blah. It's such a specific thing. For it to have emerged twice, once in plants and once in animals, seems incredibly unlikely. But here's the thing. When you have millions of years and trillions of trials, unlikely things happen. And when they really make sense, when they really work, they just have to happen once, and then they take everything else with them. So it's a good comment.
Another question, let me go to I have two more that we should definitely hit. John Mead asks, you describe ALU as parasitic DNA. What have been the negatives of having such a parasite in our genome? Why has ALU been so successful at coping itself?
Right. So
without obviously damaging.
Yeah. So ALU, like I said, it's now quieted down. So it's not copying itself anymore. It's not crashing through the genome anymore for the most part. Other transposable elements are, but the ALU element, the ALU element is not crashing through. It's totally quieted down finally. It's at least 100 million years old, ALU. So what we know is that these elements jump around the genome and they crash into genes. And when they occasionally, and when they do, it's almost always bad. So the ALU element specifically has probably led to the death and suffering of millions of individuals, trillions of individuals, maybe, I don't know, over the last 100 million years. So it's almost always bad, but occasionally, very rarely, it does something remarkable. So when these transposable elements jump around from the chromosomes, crashing through randomly, generally doing bad things, occasionally they'll pick up a piece of DNA and either move it, and that might not have any effect, or copy it. Because some of these things, the retrotransposons make copies of themselves. And so the original one stays there, the transcript gets made, reverse transcribes, and then the copy is what gets moved. That's how we have 1 million copies of ALU. But occasionally when it does that, it grabs a functioning gene and creates a new copy of it. And when you have a second copy of a gene, that's a wonderful recipe for diversification, because the original gene, or the other, whichever one, can hold on to the original function, and then the other one can tinker. It's free to experiment. And so the reason why primates have trichromatic vision, so we have 3 kinds of cones instead of just 2. Most mammals have only 2. We have 3, is because one of those genes was copied in this manner by a transposable element, and giving us 3 copies of the cones, and then of course what happened, they diverged through mutation. So instead of 2 cones trying to cover the whole color spectrum, you have 3 cones covering the color spectrum, so you cover that spectrum much better. So we have better color vision. The primates have better color vision than all of the other mammals. You may have heard that your dog is colorblind. That's not true, but they're dichromatic. They don't see as well as we do with color. We're trichromatic. And actually some females in the population are tetrachromatic, because they have mutations in one of the genes that's on the X chromosome. And since they have 2 copies, they might end up with 2 different copies. Actually, 2 of the genes are on the X chromosome. So some females are actually even better at seeing color than the rest of the population. So it's almost always bad when these DNA elements jump around the genome, but occasionally something really, really cool happens. And you know what? Kristen Griffith just said something amazing. She said, color vision helps us find fruit for vitamin C. Absolutely, that's true. And now the 2 events weren't tied mechanistically, but it just goes to show that evolution favors something happening in the right place at the right time. So how many times did ALU or whatever element copy this gene and it didn't give the animal any advantage and we never knew about it? But when it happened in an animal that was eating fruit, because remember, ripening fruit sticks out from the green. Ripening fruit is not green. It's yellow, it's red, it's whatever. So if you can see it better, you can get to the vitamin C. And it's not just vitamin C, it's also the calories and everything else that comes with the fruit. So those two events were not mechanistically tied, but they were tied by evolution because they reinforced one another. It's like the ability to drink milk as an adult. A random mutation happened, and it probably happened millions of times, but if you weren't farming, if you didn't have milk around, it would have been no advantage. It has to happen in the right place at the right time. And that's just luck. A lot of good luck got us to this point, and a lot of bad luck doomed countless ancestors. Well, they wouldn't be ancestors, actually.
Right.
Right.
Well, I asked at least one question per person, so I feel good about that. And I'd like you to comment on this. I don't know, Morris and Gabriel are going off in the chat. I think they're having a fun time. And one of them said, Morris said, so long story short, humans are a very unlucky species. I don't know if I don't think I agree with that.
Well, let me react to that, because one way I put it is we are more flawed than most in our bodies because we don't rely on our bodies to be perfect or to be functional. Because, so for example, if you couldn't run very fast, probably wouldn't make a good hunter, but you could be a good forager. If you didn't have good vision, maybe you had to do work with your hands. Or maybe you were like a shaman, like a wise person. There were just so many different ways to contribute when we were living the way that we were living with these big brains and big groups. And so I think that's a happy story, right? Because it means that you don't have to be perfect. As long as you can contribute something in some way, you don't have to be all things to all people. You just have to have something of value. And here's another reason why I think it's uplifting. There's a fossil that's one of my favorite fossils. It's called the Old Man of Dmanisi. So it's 2.5 million years old. It's a Homo erectus fossil. And this guy was probably 70, 80 years old, and he's missing all his teeth, and the bone has completely healed over. So he has no teeth for at least 2 years. How does somebody, this is before fire was controlled. Yeah, this is before fire was controlled. How does somebody survive on the foods they ate for 2 years with no teeth? Somebody was preparing and cooking, not cooking, but preparing and probably chewing his food for him. Someone was chewing his food for him, which means that his value to the group was recognized enough that they would take care of him. And so I think that that's our story. We've been taking care of our elders, for example, for a long time because they knew things that they could teach and so on. So I think it's a happy story. The fact that our bodies are flawed just shows that we rely on each other and rely on our ingenuity to survive rather than our physical prowess.
Wow, I think that's a perfect place to end. This has been a really, really good talk. I've heard this talk before and I still learned something new.
I try to change the examples for you, Bertha.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate that. Dr. Lentz is such a great supporter of ties. He's flown in one day from New York to Florida, presented in person, and flown back to New York. And so I appreciate him probably more than any other scientist that I've worked with here in ties. I want to let people know that thank you, Kenny. You let people know that there's a bunch of webinars coming up. We're trying to help teachers, as much as we can as we go online. I just linked a Crowdcast registration there to all about dogs. The author of the book called Dog is Love, and I think that would be a great one. And John linked to the Old Men of the Manishi, and Kenny Coogan linked to our website where we have several. Our next one's coming up is the history of the creationist evolution battle in Florida. That's coming up Thursday night.
Oh, that's I met him. Yeah. That's going to be a great time. Yeah.
So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you especially, Dr. Lentz. I want you to close it off for us, so you can have the last goodbye.
All right. Well, take heart. I know these are crazy, strange times. I'm in the same boat as you are, moving my classes to all online and hating it, and also trying to homeschool my own kids, which has been interesting. But here we go. It's humans with a challenge that nature brought to us. Essentially, I mean, part of it's the way we're living, but and we're solving the problems with ingenuity. So it's a good thing that just being good against viruses isn't what's necessary. Is that actually we can take social action, talk to each other, take heart, get advice, learn things, and that's how we're going to solve this problem. We've been doing this for millions of years. We'll solve this problem too.
Thank you, and good night, everybody.
Bye. It was a lot of fun.